And nanotechnology, for us, small is either the size of bits or it's the size of your smartphone, and we don't deal in any sort of organisations or systems that are much bigger than that. So, the good news is that a lot of the revolutions and the innovations that you need to make small work in that sense have already taken place. So a couple of hundred years ago you had the Industrial Revolution. That changes the amount of power available to people, and it changes the cost base of generating things like electricity. You have processing power doubling in accordance with Moore's law. That's been much discussed. But perhaps more importantly than that, you have bandwidth increasing at an even greater rate, and you have the price of data storage increasing at a faster rate than that. So actually now what you can do is agglomerate a huge amount of data, and it suddenly means that the infrastructure to do your sifting, to do your joining up of different systems, etc., is at a marginal cost level too cheap to meter. It doesn't mean that Google don't have enormous data centres out in Iceland that are costing them tens of millions of pounds a year. It just means that on a case-by-case basis, there is no point in Google charging you for a search because it costs them near as damn it nothing. So, it's also important to add that whilst the infrastructure is cheap, the data itself is expensive to gather, and it's expensive financially, but it's also expensive in a healthcare space in terms of a human cost. So every time that you don't get this data right, and you don't kind of develop the next iteration of the technology, you don't develop the next iteration of the drug, actually that's, as has already been touched on, that's somebody's breast cancer drugs that they're not getting. There are lost lives here, and there are impaired lives here as a result of not doing this sort of thing. So there's almost a moral imperative to take this further. Good. So we've got a vast library of data and concepts that we've constructed from hundreds of years of clinical expertise. That's kind of what we've been doing at Babylon as a team of 300 or so developers that have been doing that. To points about funding earlier, by virtue of, I think, our relatively charismatic chief exec, Ali Parser, for those of you who know him, been able to do quite well on the funding circuit, but that has largely come internationally. That's kind of a side note, no comment, I suppose, about the British investment scene. But it's not quite a library. Our AI lead describes it as a 36-dimensional brain. So I just thought I'd drop that into the middle of this conversation and leave you guys to figure out what that means for yourself. I certainly haven't quite managed it. So successfully searching this library requires a brilliant indexing system to understand how all the various symptoms and conditions interrelate. But it also requires a sensitive and judicious librarian that understands clinical concepts to guide patients that are actually using this system to the right answer. The good news is that we already have those. The bad news is that they're called doctors. So the only people that can do that at the moment are the doctors that we were trying to avoid the need for in the first place.